Assalamu alaikum. Ibn Khaldun is a Muslim polymath, diplomat, judge, scholar, and historian, born 700 years ago in the Maghreb in North Africa. He's mainly known for developing theories on the rise and fall of civilizations, and on what we call nowadays sociology and economics, centuries before those terms were even invented. Despite its visionary brilliance and originality, his work is not recognized enough among Muslims or mainstream academic circles. Worse, he is sometimes misunderstood, mistranslated, or taken out of context. One of the many misconceptions we can find about his work remains in the controversy about remarks that people who usually haven't read his Muqaddimah attribute to him, quote unquote. Black peoples are, as a rule, submissive to slavery, because they have little that is essentially human and have attributes that are quite similar to those of dumb animals, end of quote. First of all, we can all agree that taken at face value with this specific wording and phrasing in English, which obviously was not Ibn Khaldun's language, after centuries of Western slavery, colonialism, and segregation against black peoples, and without any context on the how and why that sentence has been allegedly written, that quote could be called blatantly racist. But was it really what Ibn Khaldun said or meant? As surprising as it might be, when we dig deeper, things are not always what they seem to be. Let's see why. Because on the one hand, Ibn Khaldun did not believe in biological races. It is even something he thoroughly debunks and explains on his magnum opus, the Muqaddimah. On the other hand, Ibn Khaldun did not have a specific hatred or contempt towards black people. In fact, he does not even see black nations as a monolith, but as a variety of kingdoms and empires, of varying levels of civilization, that sometimes even invade or fight one another. It is also important to note he had harsh words against other populations, including Arabs, although he was considering himself as one, as well as Egyptians, Slavs, and other peoples. And finally, this misconception about Ibn Khaldun reveals something deeper, a usual cognitive trap people easily fall into when looking into the past, retrospectively judging and distorting pre-modern historical figures' opinions with the ethical, political, and social rules of today. First of all, it must be clear that, unlike some of his contemporaries and unlike modern race theorists in the centuries that will follow, Ibn Khaldun did not believe in biological races, and even less in their inequality. As a knowledgeable Muslim scholar, he believes that we are all sons of Adam, and that ethnicities do not hold definitive, unchangeable characteristics. Some populations can reach social superiority because socio-political or environmental conditions allow it, like white European peoples in the past 500 years. And vice versa, some are relegated to inferiority due to exogenous factors, quote unquote. The condition of the world and of nations, their customs and sects, does not persist in the same form or in a constant manner. There are differences according to days and periods and changes from one condition to another. This is the case with individuals, times, and cities, and, in the same manner, it happens in connection with regions and districts, periods, and dynasties. End of quote. He thought that, because those changes are extremely slow to the human eye, people wrongly believe that humans hold characteristics ad vitam aeternam. And, in fact, people still make that mistake today. He uses the example of the Persians, who were once one of the most powerful and advanced nations on earth, and eventually lost superiority, quote unquote. This may be illustrated by the Persian nation. In the past, the Persians filled the world with their great numbers, when their military force was annihilated, but when the Persians came under the rule of the Arabs and were made subject to submission by force, they lasted only a short while, and were wiped out as if they had never been. One should not think that this was the result of some specific persecution. The rule of Islam is known for its justice. It happens when people lose control of their own affairs and become the instrument of someone else. End of quote. Ibn Khaldun implies that every human group in the world has, at some point of history, without exception, been considered as barbaric or inferior, quote unquote. Is the greatest chief of the Gauls worthy to be set on the same level as even the meanest citizen of Rome? For who does not know that to this very day the Gauls retain the monstrous and barbarous customs of sacrificing men? They stroll from end to end of the forum with vague threats and uncouth barbarian threats upon their lips. End of quote. Or, quote unquote, the Celts live in unwalled villages. They slept on beds of leaves and fed on meat. Their lives were very simple, and they had no knowledge whatsoever of art and science. End of quote. The populations described here by the Roman Cicero and the Greek Polybius are for a large part the ancestors of today's France or Great Britain, two of the most advanced economic and political powers nowadays, and centers of two of the largest colonial empires of all time. Those quotes are comparable to the one attributed to Ibn Khaldun, but they do not resonate the same since those two populations have not been recently living under centuries of political, economic, social and symbolic domination. The Muslim thinker wrote in length that the characteristics of a human group exist at a specific time but can change gradually. Then what explains differences between humans? Ibn Khaldun says there are two reasons. As we said, one of the central points of his theories is the importance of social, environmental and climatic conditions, quote unquote. When superfluous humidity on food ascends to the brain, the mind and the ability to think are dulled. The result is stupidity, carelessness, and a general intemperance. This is the case of those Berbers of the Maghreb who have plenty of seasonings and wet, as compared to those who lead a frugal life and are restricted by barley or durra. The latter are superior both intellectually and physically. End of quote. It should be noted in this quote that he describes the inhabitants of his own land, in the Maghreb, with the same terms he was supposedly describing black peoples at the beginning of his video. But in both cases, race is irrelevant. It is all about environment, as we will see later. In that regard, he was greatly inspired by ancient Greek philosophers, who believed that climate had an incidence on the way humans look, behave, and build a civilization. Why does he insist on that point? He's actually going against what other Arab historians, like the famous Al-Mas'udi, have suggested, quote unquote. Al-Mas'udi undertook to investigate the reason for the levity, excitability, and emotionalism in black people, and attempted to explain it. However, he did no better than to report that the reason is a weakness of their brain, which results in a weakness of their intellect. This is an inconclusive and unproven statement. End of quote. For him, humans are all the same. Only climatic environments change the way they look and their civilizational outcome. In a nutshell, Ibn Khaldun argues that all humans, without exception, have an animalistic side. We all have primitive urges to eat, sleep, and reproduce ourselves. But what makes humans different is that they all have the cognitive capability to domesticate those impulses and go beyond that animalistic condition via religion, spirituality, but also material cooperation between humans to improve economic productivity, as well as the confiscation of power by supreme authority to channel subjects' individual and collective inspirations. However, he says that cognitive capability is more likely to flourish under a temperate and irrigated environment. This is why the most ancient empires, writing traditions, largest buildings and biggest cities occurred and spread for the most part in temperate climates, not too cold and not too hot, like in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India and China, and not in Scandinavia or Central Africa. Ibn Khaldun used to divide the world in climatic zones, quote unquote. The inhabitants of the Maghreb, of Syria, the two Iraqs, Western India and China, as well as of Spain, also the European Christians nearby, the Galicians, and all those who live together with these peoples or near them in the three temperate zones. The Iraq and Syria are directly in the middle and therefore are the most temperate of all these countries. The first and second zones are excessively hot and black, and the sixth and seventh zone cold and white. End of quote. Think about it. At a time when economic statistics were not available, an objective proxy to measure the wealth of a city was the size of its population. Throughout history, the largest cities in the world have always been in a sub-region of temperate areas. That was also excluding Northern Europe until London with industrialization. Large tropical cities only started to emerge in modern times, with the advancement of medicine, electrification, and the invention of air conditioning. When the climate is too hot and humid or too cold, there will not be a very deep division of labor in human societies. Human constructions will be rudimentary, cuisine will be less refined, and clothes less sophisticated, using animal skin instead of silk or other elaborated fabrics that can only be made in a society advanced enough to have people specialized in those crafts. But again, for Ibn Khaldun, this is by no means caused by race-based intrinsic cognitive deficiency, but by an environment that is hostile for the blossoming of advanced civilization. Neither it is a condition that stays the same forever, quote unquote. The inhabitants of the zones that are far from temperate, such as the 1st, 2nd, 6th, and 7th zones, are also farther removed from being temperate in all their conditions. Their buildings are of clay and reeds. Their foodstuffs are dhurra and herbs. Their clothing is the leaves of trees, which they sew together to cover themselves, or animal skins. Many of them go naked. The fruits and seasonings of their countries are strange, and inclined to be intemperate. In their business dealings, they do not use the two noble metals, but copper, iron, or skins, upon which they set a value for the purpose of business dealings. End of quote. As we said, it is also in temperate areas that humans are the most likely to develop scriptures, write historical information, stories, knowledge, and crafts that can be passed to later generations more easily than oral tradition and word to mouth. That is why one of the drivers of Western supremacy in the past centuries is the development of the printing press, allowing the spread of knowledge in a much easier manner, as well as, most recently, digitalization and the internet. Quote unquote. Now, among the inhabitants of these zones, among whom we have historical information are, for instance, the Arabs, the Rum, the Persians, the Israelites, the Greeks, the Indians, and the Chinese. The inhabitants of the middle zones are temperate in their physique and character, and in their ways of life. They have all the natural conditions necessary for a civilized life, such as the ways of making a living, dwellings, crafts, sciences, political leadership, and royal authority. They thus have had various manifestations of prophecy: religious groups, dynasties, religious laws, sciences, countries, cities, building, horticulture, splendid crafts, and everything else that is temperate. End of quote. The last part is especially enlightening when we compare it to Polybius' remarks about Northwestern Europeans being foreign to arts and sciences. For Ibn Khaldun, this explains the emergence of prestigious civilizations like Egypt, Persia, Greek, Rome, Byzantium, Abbasid Caliphate, India, China, etc. Countries like France, England, Japan, the United States, because of their geographically adjacent position, were actually at the periphery of more ancient civilizations, like China, Rome, Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, etc. Quote unquote. Mesopotamia invented metallurgy, agriculture, writing, sailing, the wheel, chemistry, pharmaceutics, astronomy, law, algorithms, calendars, maps, metrics, and maintained technological superiority for about 5,000 years of history over northwestern Europe. End of quote. And later on, as humans have domesticated Earth climates, countries located in hotter and colder countries have started to emerge. Quote unquote. Air conditioning was a most important invention for Singaporeans, perhaps one of the signal inventions of history. It changed the nature of civilization by making development possible in the tropics. Without air conditioning, you can work only in the cool early morning hours or at dusk. The first thing I did upon becoming Prime Minister was to install air conditioners in buildings where the civil service worked. This was key to public efficiency. End of quote. Now, let's get back to Ibn Khaldun's infamous alleged quote, mentioned at the beginning. In that sentence, he was not talking about all black nations, but about those living in tropical areas. He describes them as being as such, not from the intrinsic biological capabilities, but because of their environment, which would equally affect any human being in the same condition. He compares tropical climate to the effect of a hot bath on the human mood, quote unquote. Likewise, when those who enjoy a hot bath inhale the air of the bath so that the heat of the air enters their spirits and make them hot, they are found to experience joy. It often happens that they start singing, as singing has its origin in gladness. Now, those black peoples live in the hot zone, of the earth. Their spirits are hotter and consequently more expanded. As a result, they are more quickly moved to joy and gladness, and they are merrier. Excitability is the direct consequence. End of quote. So Ibn Khaldun thinks that if you live in a place that is too hot or too cold, again, without air conditioner or heater, your humor might sometimes be out of balance. It is not racist in the sense we understand the term today. Ibn Khaldun believes that there's an optimal climate for human civilization to flourish, regardless of your skin color. If you were living in a tropical or polar area with no air conditioner or heater around, and having close to no possibility to experience or even imagine other climates and temperatures because airplanes, trains, cars, and modern boats did not exist generation after generation, how would that affect your mood? Ibn Khaldun adds that this is not a condition exclusive to black people living in tropical areas. Likewise, he points out the difference of temperament between people in warm coastal cities, who are said to be more joyful and careless, and people in cold mountainous areas said to be in a gloomier mood but more provident, which would explain, according to him, the difference in temperament between people in two places he has lived and worked in: Fez, the Marinid capital in Morocco, and Cairo, the Mamluk capital in Egypt. Quote unquote. The Egyptians are dominated by joyfulness, levity, and disregard for the future. They store no provisions of food, neither for a month nor a year ahead, but purchase most of it daily in the market. Fez, in the Maghreb, on the other hand, lies inland and is surrounded by cold hills. Its inhabitants can be observed to look sad and gloomy, and to be too much concerned for the future. Although a man in Fez might have provisions of bread stored, sufficient to last him for years, he always goes to the market early to buy his food for the day, because he is afraid to consume any of his hoarded food. End of quote. So, according to Ibn Khaldun, climate is the first reason behind civilizational differences between humans. The second being religious revelation or ideology. A reason revealing that he does not see black Africans as one entity, but multitudes of diverse populations. For Ibn Khaldun, the world of humans was, at his time, divided between three areas. Areas aware of divine laws, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish. Areas under the restraining authority of rulership, outside the people of the book, and those who had no restraining authority at all. Three types of human societies: monotheistic, pagan, and uncivilized. Precisely for this reason, he saw some black African states, like Christian Abyssinia, Muslim Gao, Takrur, or Mali, as cultural equals to civilizations located in temperate zones. Quote unquote. Black nations who live in the first zone are ignorant of prophecy and do not have a religious law, except for the part that lives near the temperate regions. This part includes, for instance, the Abyssinians, who are neighbors of the Yemenites and have been Christians, from pre-Islamic to Islamic times down to the present, and the Mali and the Takrur, who live close to the Maghreb, and, at this time, are Muslims. They are said to have adopted Islam in the 13th century. End of quote. Therefore, his remarks do not include the kingdoms and empires mentioned above, because they have a state, produce significant wealth, are under the influence of religion, and maintain a sustainable social order. What Ibn Khaldun talked about at the beginning of this video are the populations living beyond those areas. In the citation below, we can clearly see he makes a difference between black believers and unbelievers. Quote unquote. To the south of this river, there is a black people called Lemlem. They are unbelievers. They brand themselves on the faiths and temples. The people of Ghana and Takrur invaded their country, capture them, and sell them to merchants, who transport them to the Maghreb. There, they constitute the ordinary mass of slaves. Beyond them in the south, there is no civilization in the proper sense. They are only humans who are closer to dumb animals than to rational beings. They live in thickets and caves and eat herbs and unprepared grain. They frequently ate each other. End of quote. It should be understood that he has never been to those countries and heavily relied on external sources, like chronicles from travelers, or correspondences between North and West African rulers, as well as sources from Mali, which he had access to in Morocco and Egypt, and took for granted, not by laziness, but because traveling from the Maghreb to West Africa via the Sahara Desert was tedious and dangerous, quote unquote. The merchants who dare to enter the lands of black peoples are the most prosperous and wealthy of all people. The distance and the difficulty of the road they travel are great. They have to cross a difficult desert, which is made almost inaccessible by fear of danger, and beset by the danger of thirst. The distance of this road is braved only by a very few people. Therefore, the goods of the lands of black peoples are found only in small quantities among us, and they are particularly expensive. The same applies to our goods among them. End of quote. And finally, skin color, according to Ibn Khaldun, whether it's black or white, is not permanent across lineage, and do not carry deterministic connotations, quote unquote. Black peoples from the south who settle in the temperate zones are found to produce descendants whose color gradually turns white in the course of time. Vice versa, inhabitants from the north who settle in the south produce descendants whose color turns black. End of quote. As a first conclusion, Ibn Khaldun's remark about character and phenotypes are deductions from the influence of environment and can change over time. And by extension, Ibn Khaldun's worldview would need to be readjusted to nowadays conditions. Since most of the world has access to air conditioners and heaters, share more and more similar diets and lifestyle, human appearance and societies tend to converge. We live now in a time where race is almost completely decoupled and decorrelated from the direct environment they grew up in. You can be black and born in the polar circle, or blonde and born in a tropical climate. At his time, it would have been possible to establish an advanced civilization in a city like Dubai or some remote tropical land. Humans need an optimal climate and temperature to reach optimal productivity, the same way plants flourish under an optimal climate. Growing a plant in cold polar winter or under an arid desertic summer is harder, if not impossible. Now, we have put in light that Ibn Khaldun did not see skin color as deterministic, but did he despise or have any kind of contempt towards black people nonetheless?